Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. Richard Baxter, the English Puritan churchman and theologian, was perhaps one of the most prolific English language authors in the 17th century. His writings were wide-ranging, from doctrinal theology to devotional classics. And his practical theology was a model of German sociologist Max Weber's understanding of the Protestant work ethic. Baxter's worldly aestheticism was focused on service to others across sectarian divides. His book, How to Do Good to Many, The Public Good in the Christian's Life, offers practical guidance to lay people grounded in Christian faith. This classic, updated for modern readers by Jordan Ballor, remains a thought-provoking and inspirational meditation on Paul's admonition to do good to all people. Today, Acton's Dan Huger talks with Jordan Ballor, Senior Research Fellow and Director of Publishing at the Acton Institute, about Baxter's life and work and the new updated edition of How to Do Good to Many. You can check out resources for this episode in our show notes, posted at blog.acton.org. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend. Acton Line is available on Google Play, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I am joined by Jordan Ballor, Senior Research Fellow and Director of Publishing at the Acton Institute. He is also a postdoctoral researcher in theology and economics at the Free University Amsterdam as part of the What Good Markets Are Good For project. His most recent book is titled Beyond Dort and De Auxiliis, The Dynamics of Protestant and Catholic Soteriology in the 16th and 17th Centuries, and he is also general editor of the 12-volume Abraham Kuyper Collected Works in Public Theology. Today we'll be discussing the English Puritan churchman and theologian Richard Baxter and his book, recently updated for modern readers, How to Do Good to Many, The Public Good is the Christian's Life. Jordan, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for having me.
First off, Richard Baxter was perhaps the most prolific English language author of the 17th century, yet his work will be unfamiliar to much of our audience. Who was Richard Baxter, and how did he come to be such a force in the 17th century?
Well, Baxter was a nonconforming Reformed or Puritan pastor in England in the 17th century. His dates are 1615 to 1691. So that places him in his adulthood in the middle of the English Civil War. And he, again, lived most of the 17th century. As you said, he's been called the most prolific writer in English in the 17th century. So that's one of the reasons that he's known, is because of just the sheer quantity and volume of his writings. He's also well known particularly for his practical work, his practical theology. So there's an edition of his works in the 19th century that was reissued of the practical works of Richard Baxter. And so this is primarily how he's known into the 20th century in our own times, as a kind of a practical devotional writer. This doesn't quite capture the fullness of Baxter, even though he is one of the premier pietistic kind of writers from that Puritan era. He himself considered his most important work to be his doctrinal work. He wrote mostly in English, but his premier work was a Latin work called the Methodus Theologiae, and that's what he considered his greatest achievement, although it didn't ever really receive the popular acclaim that he wanted it to during his own lifetime or even yet to today. So most people know Baxter for his insights into practical ministry, his very urgent, heartfelt, compelling, wise insights into the Christian life, and particularly in the context of Christian ministry.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned in your introduction to this volume that Baxter was a major source for German sociologist and economic historian Max Weber in his formulation of the concept of the Protestant work ethic. What is the Protestant work ethic, and in what ways is Baxter sort of emblematic of that spirit?
Yeah, so this is another way in which Baxter is received into the 20th century, into our own day, is as this kind of paradigmatic figure in Weber's thought for the Protestant ethic, which Weber himself describes or defines most succinctly as worldly asceticism. So there's the worldly element where it's oriented to life in this world and the practical realities of that, but it's an asceticism as a kind of a spiritual posture towards that world. So there's a distance there. I would think of Baxter as more of a holy worldliness or something like that with Baxter. That'd be a bit more accurate. Although if you understand asceticism rightly, perhaps not as Weber described it, that would be an accurate way of describing this kind of loose grip on the world, in the sense that you're not tightly trying to hold on to everything in the world, but you're not entirely distant from it or withdrawing from the world and looking heavenly or heavenward only. So, Weber took Baxter as this kind of, as we said, paradigmatic figure for embodiment of the Protestant ethic. Weber said this about Baxter. He said, Baxter stands out above many other writers on Puritan ethics, both because of his eminently practical and realistic attitude. We've already mentioned a little bit of that in his work. And at the same time, says Weber, because of the universal recognition accorded to his works, which have gone through many new editions and translations. So this is at the end of the 19th, early 20th century that Weber's saying this about Baxter. He describes one of Baxter's larger works, the Christian Directory, this way. It's the most complete compendium of Puritan ethics and is continually adjusted to the practical experiences of his own ministerial activity. So in the middle of his life, Baxter spent about 2 decades as a pastor in Kidderminster, where there's a statue of him to this day. So certainly he had an effect within his own church context. Much of his wisdom and insights are drawn out of that very direct pastoral context. He was a very diligent pastor. He was concerned about examining the spiritual state of his congregants. He would have them come and visit him and have appointments basically throughout the year so that he would visit with everybody during the year. One of the things that got him in trouble was his penchant for having extra ecclesiastical meetings, conventicles, these sorts of things. He was very associations, pastoral associations, and so on. He was very engaged in living out ministry, not just within the context of the corporate worship itself, say, but throughout every dimension of the Christian life.
So working through a very rigorous understanding of what it is to be in the world, but not of the world.
Right.
Perfect. Baxter is also something of an ecumenical figure, or at least iconoclastic figure in his own time. The phrase mere Christianity, which appears in this book, is familiar to many from the writings of C.S. Lewis. What is Baxter's own understanding of that?
Yeah, so Baxter would distinguish, I think, as the great bulk of the Christian tradition between essential teachings and non-essential teachings. And so that's what that phrase mere Christianity is trying to get at, is the shared commonalities that all Christians profess and believe. It could be, say, creedal orthodoxy, for example. And that's one way that it's traditionally been understood. But it wasn't just a kind of a formulaic affirmation for Baxter. It actually formed the way he approached his own ministry. So when he was in Kidderminster, he had a pastoral association for all the pastors in the area, irrespective of their confession, that would get together and just talk about the challenges they were facing, the local context, these sorts of things. So in many ways, that you can think of that as a kind of a precursor to what you see in many settings now in the United States, for example, in urban settings where whether you're a Wesleyan or a Baptist or Presbyterian, you want to know what the church down the street is doing in terms of their outreach to the community, diaconal work, and these sorts of things, so you're not, being redundant so that you can learn from one another, these sorts of things. So there's a kind of a very practical side to Baxter's ecumenism there as well.
Yeah. Now, we talked a little bit about what it means to do practical theology, and we also talked a little bit about how Baxter understood his doctrinal work to actually be sort of the center of what he was doing. Now, this How to Do Good to Many is an example of this practical theology. How does that fit into Baxter's doctrinal concerns? Because that's animating a lot of this work as well.
Yeah, so I would say Baxter has a kind of a classical conception of the relationship between right belief and right practice. So ideally, your actions are going to be informed by your beliefs and formed by them. So it's important to have proper beliefs in a propositional sense at the very least, but also just to know the truth. But that's different than doing the right thing, even though those two things are intimately related and one ought to follow from the other. So for Baxter, all of his practical insights are grounded in the right beliefs that one ought to hold. Now, we've already seen that there's a distinction between necessary truths or more fundamental doctrines and things that are more disputable or adiaphora and these sorts of things that Baxter's thought. So he is definitely working out of more of a classical paradigm. His emphasis is that right belief must terminate in good works, that they have to have this kind of practical expression. He uses the kind of standard biblical imagery of someone who has the right beliefs but doesn't follow through with them being a kind of a withered branch. And so then you have to wonder about how that person is connected to the trunk, to Christ himself, for example, if they don't have these kinds of practical expressions. Part of that is contextual in the sense that he saw the licentiousness that was on display during the English Civil War, and that greatly concerned him. So his first work was a kind of attack on antinomianism. And so even though we've talked about his practical concerns, his very, very practical ministerial concerns, he was also a controversialist and a polemicist of sorts in the 17th century. You don't write that much without disputing with people. He was involved in disputes over justification, disputes over predestination, disputes over the role of the law in the Christian life. So his opponents would call him a neo-nomian who was, more concerned with good works than with true belief. All of that's very interesting because he's kind of an eclectic figure. He's fascinating for that reason. He was largely self-taught, so I think that his erudition is underappreciated because he doesn't have the kind of formal credentials that many of his interlocutors at the time had. He comes into some of these disputes with a bit of a chip on his shoulder because he's engaging people like John Owen and others who are luminaries of their day and have respected positions, and he's in a sense a kind of a country parson who's self-taught and doesn't have the respect that one might have otherwise. So what he brings to bear is a kind of a brilliance of mind, an attitude, a disposition of there's a bit of pugnaciousness in Baxter. He won't let things go, and there's a dogged kind of determination in his pursuit of the truth and right action. So he brings all of that to his controversial writings, and one other aspect of that is that's underappreciated is he is extremely well read. So there's he's what I would call an eclectic scholastic in the sense that he knows scholastic distinctions very well. Part of this goes back to this ecumenism dynamic that we talked about earlier. He knows not just, say, the kind of Reformed Orthodox of the continent and the British divines, but he knows Roman Catholics, Jesuits. He's well read in all of the scholastic literature of his time and employs this. So if he finds something that he likes in Suarez, he's happy to say, I found this in Suarez and it's really helpful. So for certain kinds of Reformed people, that raises warning signs. But I think in a way it's more it's a feature of this kind of international discussion that Baxter is seeking to be a part of that's going on, which is there's a shared framework for using categories and arguments, even if you disagree about the content the doctrine of justification, for example. You're working in many cases with a shared terminology, or at least you're fighting about the terminology within a shared framework.
Yeah. Now this particular book is addressed partially to the people he's engaged in doctrinal controversy, but it seems to be addressed to a broader audience as well. To whom is this text addressed, and who is it that he's urging that responsibility to do good to?
Yeah, so the work we're looking at and that we reissued, and it's one of my favorite works, and it had long been a desire of mine to get this work a little bit more exposure. Dates from 1682, so that's when it's published. The title is, and I'm going to just look at the 17th century title page, it's How to Do Good to Many, or the subtitle, The Public Good is the Christian's Life, Directions and Motives to It, that is, doing the public good, intended for an auditory of London citizens, and published for them for want of leave to preach them. So there's a clue there that Baxter had been ejected from the ministry, or basically from 1660 onward, had lived in various states of persecution or sanctioned by the civil authorities after the Restoration. So he's got things he wants to share. It's basically a sermon that he would presumably preach, although there's obviously a difference between the printed word and actually delivering the sermon. And so there's a kind of an art in the 17th century of publishing sermons that you have to take into account. But it's cast in the genre of a printed sermon for want of a pulpit. He doesn't have a pulpit to preach, so the printing press gives him this kind of a medium, a way of getting his message out. The text is Galatians 6:10, that is, do good to everyone. The text of that verse continues, especially those of the household of faith. So there's a priority of the church within the context of that verse. And right away Baxter says, my point of departure is Galatians 6:10, how to do good to many, this mandate that the Apostle Paul gives us to do good to many. And I'm just going to stop there because to do the whole verse, I don't have space. So it's an interesting rhetorical move in the sense that he really wants to talk about the universal obligations to do good to all. It's not that he doesn't think that there are ways of prioritizing that are properly prioritizing. Of course, he would affirm the second half of the verse. But what his focus on in this treatise or this text is really on that universal call to do good. So his fundamental point of departure really is what you could call a shared anthropology, irrespective of Christian confession. So in that sense, the scope of his message is universal. Mm-hmm. The direct audience comes on later pages. He says in his epistle at the beginning, this is to the Christian merchants of London and everybody else. Mm-hmm. So he's got a very interesting audience there in mind in the sense that he wants to address not primarily political leaders, not primarily churchmen in the sense of being ordained, the hierarchy of the Church of England or something like that. He's addressing Christian lay people who have some position of authority and influence and ability and means within the society, which is a fascinating rhetorical approach, and it displays what I think is motivating him, which is this idea of, you could call it a holistic Christian discipleship that has to permeate and influence all of a Christian's life, whether you're ordained or not. And so, yeah, there's a kind of to put it in contemporary anachronistic terms, there's some resonances with something like the business as mission movement in the United States among evangelicalism, which sees business and the business world as a legitimate calling, but one that has to be imbued with this sense of Christian discipleship. So that's his kind of explicitly identified audience right there. Are the Christian merchants, the people of means in the city of London.
Yeah. So these are folks with resources. These are people with some influence, some reach, particularly economic. And one of the questions then is, what does Baxter mean by good? Is this merely the dispersion of these material means? Right. Is this something larger?
So the central dynamic for Baxter here that again permeates the entire treatment, and let me just say this: he goes into very fine points of detail in terms of the kinds of prudential instructions he's giving. So, it's not like he's saying everybody who listens has to do A, X, Y, or Z. He's saying, here are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about. Here are some very practical suggestions, again, respecting that he's not a Christian business leader, but here are the kinds of things you might think about doing. These are ways that you should consider for fulfilling your obligation to do good to all. He defines the good in very classical terms. God is the highest and ultimate good. Being is its own form of good. Existence is its own form of good. And the good that he's concerned about is conformity to the will of God, which is another way of saying conformity to your created nature, the way that God created you to be, to fulfill the purposes with which God has brought you into existence. So you could think of it in a very kind of, there's some continuity there with say, a Thomistic understanding of the highest good and our participation in created reality and these sorts of things, and certainly conformity to the natural good. So he'll say things like, to do good to all is a universal responsibility for all people. Christians in particular, because of the work of the Holy Spirit in regeneration and sanctification, have been equipped to execute this good in ways that unregenerate people maybe haven't. So that's why there's such a sharp point on that Christians are to be the kind of vanguard of doing good in the world. Not that there's lesser common goods that can be pursued by people who are not Christians, but because of his understanding of the relationship between nature and grace, that grace restores nature and allows us to start to fulfill some of those natural ends for which we've been created. Christians are uniquely suited, and certainly Christians of some material means and influence are uniquely suited to bring to bear all of the goods and gifts and treasures and talents that they have to doing good in the world.
Yeah, and this he gives a lot of practical guidance in, because often there's a lot of anxiety with the prospect of doing good. There's a notion of a good so comprehensive. Mm-hmm. What sort of guidance does Baxter give to people who have that concern, who want to do good, but see a lot going wrong in the world that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. One of the key insights that he provides, I think, is a disposition, a concern to properly orient what you could call the penultimate and the ultimate, or the temporal and the eternal, or the material and the spiritual. So in many ways, this is reminiscent, obviously, of themes in the Sermon on the Mount, seeking first the kingdom of God, and all of these other kind of worldly things will be added to you, Jesus says. But you have to have those priorities rightly ordered for that to function that way. Mm-hmm. And this is essentially what Baxter's trying to communicate to people. That is, pursuing somebody's ultimate good. Yes, there's an irreducible, unmistakable grounding in eternity and the spiritual nature of the human person that has to be respected and has to frame everything. At the same time, we're not just spiritual beings. We're material creatures as well, or creatures that have a material aspect to our existence, and you have to do justice to that. So again, using a kind of scholastic distinction, he says you have to think about the difference between the order of estimation, he calls it, and the order of execution. So the first thing you do in time may not be the most important in terms of its ultimate value, but that's just the way that things have to work because we are temporal material creatures. So he uses the example of the Lord's Prayer, and he says, we pray for our daily bread as you're going through the petitions of the Lord's Prayer before we pray for pardon and spiritual blessings. Not as if it were better. That is not as if daily bread or material goods are better than spiritual goods. but that nature is supposed before grace, and that we cannot be Christians if we're not men. So there's a kind of a fundamental orientation to the reality of how human beings exist in the world and adjusting your outreach, your relationship, your message to that reality. So this is, again, a kind of a practical aspect to Baxter's work, is that he's concerned with finding people how they are, as they're operating, and working through those means that are most appropriate to addressing people in their situation. And for human beings who have this material as well as spiritual existence, it means working sometimes through daily bread first, rather than hitting them with the truth about the spiritual reconciliation that Jesus Christ offers. So he gives very practical insights into how that might work out in the context of everyday ministry, everyday life, everyday Christian following, discipleship of Jesus Christ, and trying to maintain that proper relationship between ultimate goods and more penultimate or temporal goods.
Yeah. And one of the things that he's concerned about is before you can do any of that, you have to have a motivation. Mm-hmm. He says, at one point in this book, he says, that the Christian should wake up wanting to do good. Right. And yet he also realizes that experientially in time, often our mornings are not like that.
Yeah.
How does he get at this question of motivation?
Well, I think you're right. He's identifying the way things ought to be, and then looking at the reality and seeing the dissonance between those two things and trying to address that in this work. And part of addressing that dissonance is recognizing it, naming it. It's part of it's addressing it directly to people. So even telling his audience this, he started to address the problem, which is identify it and provide them with an instruction about it, which is as soon as everybody reads that, they realize, yes, on some primal level, this is how we ought to be, and we're not that way. There's a kind of a Romans 1 and 2 dynamic here. We all see that this is how it should be, and we immediately recognize that we're not living this way. But in that is a call to live this way at the same time. So even identifying that dissonance is in its own way a kind of exhortation that Baxter is giving. It's its own form of motivation, which is to do the best we can, empowered by the Holy Spirit as Christians, again, within the context of this Christian audience, to execute that. He's really big on the public good and the common good in this piece, right? And this is one of the interesting things about the common good is, depending which common good you're talking about, certainly if it's the highest created common good, you can't, in a way, get up and do it, right? Mm-hmm. Like you could wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to go out and do the common good today. Okay, so that's an abstract concept in some sense. What actual things are you going to do? What actual good things are you going to do? And this gets, again, back to Baxter's very practical insights and advice and guidances that he provides, which is there are all these other little things that you have to do to promote the common good in a more general sense. Another dynamic that's at play in this treatise is the very Augustinian understanding of what we would call nowadays solidarity and subsidiarity. That is, there's this universal common bond that unites all of humanity as created in God's image. The way Augustine puts it, all are to be loved equally. But we don't know everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? You have a finite circle of influence, circle of relationships. Maybe Facebook has made that circle wider than it would have been in other ages, right? Mm-hmm. Depending how many friends you've got on Facebook or followers on Twitter, maybe you're connected in some ephemeral sense to more people than you would have otherwise been, but still it's limited. And Baxter picks up on this as well, and this is where subsidiarity comes into play, this notion of proximity and the vagaries of relationship that define and give substance to this more universal sense of solidarity, the shades of relational life and the dynamics there. And so Baxter says you have to basically start with yourself and work outward, because that's the way God created us. He placed us in a certain position. He placed us within a certain context. He made sure that we were born providentially to a certain family in a certain time in a certain place. And so your promotion of the public good or the common good as a Christian is to live fully within that context that God has given you, all of the gifts he's given you, all the relationships, the unique relationships that he's given you, and work outward from there. Now, some people are going to have a broader calling in the sense that they're called to be leaders in a political sense, or some merchants are going to have larger businesses than others. Some may be domestic, some may be global nowadays. So there are differences there. But there's a kind of a universal calling for all Christians to live out within the scope of their proximity, this call to do good to as many people as you can.
Yeah, and that orientation is really key to the motivation too. Because when you alluded to Facebook earlier, I think this is one of the problems is there's a perception of participation in which you're not actually free to participate in the ways that you are in your neighborhood, in your community, with your spouse, with your children, and that is disorienting and lends itself to skipping by that work of discerning your own circumstances and vocation that Baxter sees as sort of central. I'm reminded there's the great Bill Murray classic Groundhog Day, in which he relives the day of Groundhog Day over and over and over again until, and he sort of descends into this hedonistic lifestyle for a while, but eventually he's only released from it when he figures out how to occupy every space of the day with doing good. And sometimes that good just takes place in a minute interaction of a kind word. Sometimes it takes the place of a musical performance. Other times it takes the place of, saving someone from physical harm. And all of that is going to look very, very different in the life of the individual person. And I think Baxter is really powerful in that. What is a keen sort of point of orientation that you've found in your own life with Baxter in trying to do good to many?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons this treatise has resonated with me so much over the years, and I first encountered it while I was in seminary probably 15 years ago or earlier, or longer ago. It's the clear authenticity with which he writes. I mean, he's clearly concerned about this. It's not just like something that he feels like he has to say because he's preaching on every text or something like that. This is clearly something that motivates him. So he speaks with an authenticity that comes through the pages even hundreds of years later. It's that combination of zeal and insight, because there are really a lot of wisdom in Baxter's words here. So those two things have kind of made this treatise important for me to return to time and again when I'm thinking about the fundamental challenges of discipleship. And he talked about a lot of the complexities that are different now, say, than when Baxter was writing hundreds of years ago. In terms of particularities, the world is much more complex. But that doesn't obviate the truth of many of these fundamental insights that he provides us. And as you mentioned, one of those really is this fundamental rooting of the Christian life within the divine will, that is, within the context of God's will for us. So one passage in particular, and certainly for Reformed Christians, this is a kind of perhaps a stereotypical or caricature of the dilemma of Reformed Christians is, with such a strong view of God's providence and sovereignty, what place is there for me to do anything? Or what good is there for me to even do in the world? And Baxter says this. He says, it's God's great mercy to mankind that he will use us all in doing good to one another. And it's a great part of his wise government of the world that in societies men should be tied to it by the sense of every particular man's necessity. And it's a greatest honor to those that he makes his almoners or servants to convey his gifts to others, God bids you give nothing but what is his and no otherwise your own, but as his stewards. It is his bounty and your service or stewardship which is to be exercised. So it's this very rich sense of stewardship as definitive, as distinctive perhaps of the Christian life, of Christian discipleship that has really stuck with me.
Yeah. Jordan, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you so much for all your work in making this accessible to a modern audience. The wisdom here is really great, and that turning a firm belief in God's care, in God's providence for us, into also a mantle of responsibility and stewardship is something that's timeless.
Well, I'm thankful to have had a part in hopefully communicating Baxter's wisdom to a new generation.
As always, thank you so much for listening today. Our podcast team loves putting the show together for you every week. And it's so encouraging to hear back from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. You can reach our team at actonline@acton.org.